Good afternoon and welcome to today's Meet the Pro workshop with Dr. Jared Schwartzer, behavioral neuroscientist at Mount Holyoke College. Dr. Jared Schwartzer is assistant professor of psychology and education at Mount Holyoke, and he specializes in behavioral neuroscience, neuroimmunology, neurodevelopment, and animal models of autism spectrum disorders. Dr. Schwartzer is also the director of the Schwartzer Lab, which focuses on the growing field of immune-induced mental health by translating clinical observations into testable hypotheses. This work lies at the intersection of behavioral neuroscience, neuroimmunology, and biomedical research to identify how interactions between the immune system and the nervous system throughout gestation shape offspring brain and behavior development. Dr. Schwartz earned his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD at Northeastern University, and he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Autism Research Training Program at the University of California, Davis Mind Institute, where he studied with leaders in the field of neurodevelopmental disorders. As a doctoral student at Northeastern University, Jared Schwartzer was awarded a Lagerspitz Award for outstanding research from the International Society for Research on Aggression. More recently, he received funding from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development to explore the link between maternal allergies and asthma and their consequences on offspring brain and behavior development. Welcome, Dr. Schwartzer.
Wow, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah.
As I mentioned to you, Matt, that I love community outreach and chatting with emerging potential scientists.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful introduction and really makes what I think is pretty straightforward sound more complicated than it needs to be. One of my interests in research is to answer questions that are sometimes difficult or maybe not really ethical to answer in humans. I'll give you an example. A project we just finished are looking at whether or not using vaping, using e-cigarettes during pregnancy, if that's a better alternative to smoking during pregnancy, and does that have any effects on the developing child? And it would not really be a good idea to go out and find some pregnant women and have them vape or not vape. And so I use mice in my lab to try to understand some of those questions so that we can get a sense of how do we want to inform public health about these things. So we certainly can talk more about that in a bit, but the other part of that intro you touched on is I spent a long time learning about brain development and neurodevelopmental disorders. You know, for when I started my research career about 15 years ago, they were just coming into this whole vaccine autism connection, which was very controversial and really difficult to answer, again, ethically in humans. So I was trying to use mice to see if we can get some insights into these answers. So I'm really always looking to see what are some of the challenges in the world right now and how can we use some neuroscience research, some basic tools to help answer them. In fact, I'm looking right now at how this pandemic, how COVID-19 might be some inspiration for how it could help address some of those problems moving forward.
Right.
I want to give a little bit about kind of how I got started, because I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a scientist. There's nobody in my family that's a doctor or anything, so this was a pipe dream for me. And I really started as an elementary school teacher. So I went to college and I loved teaching. And actually, I'm a certified elementary school teacher in the state of Massachusetts. I spent a year teaching fifth grade. I did a few years of substitute teaching. And I was good at teaching. I liked teaching, but I felt a little unfulfilled. And I happened to have stumbled into a class towards the end of my education. It was an introduction to behavioral neuroscience. And I'd never taken a class that I was so excited to get out of bed and get into the class for. That had never happened to me where I was eager. This was in college, and I remember thinking, I can't believe people can spend their lives studying this. And that's when I realized this was a field for me. So it wasn't that I sought it out, it's that I fell into a class that I just was thinking about every moment that I wasn't in class. And so I followed that more. I ended up volunteering in a lab. I needed to pick up some extra credits. And so I worked in a lab and washing dishes and such, but I was so intrigued that I'd wash dishes and then kind of listen over my shoulder at the problems they were trying to solve and then try to actually see if I can offer some assistance. And so I just ended up working in the lab, and that led to the head researcher coming to me and saying, have you ever thought about graduate school? You'd be good at it. And the answer is I'd never thought about graduate school. And that really taught me the power of telling somebody that they're worthy, right? Had no one ever said to me, hey, Jared, you're good at this, you should think about doing this, I would have never gone down that path. And so I try to say that to my students. And I think everyone listening should listen out there for what are those encouragements that you're getting that are kind of directing you towards, hey, maybe I should go farther down this route. So I left my public education, my elementary teaching degree to go get a PhD in behavioral neuroscience. And this was right around the time I had mentioned that autism and vaccines were really a hot topic. And I was doing this in Boston, Massachusetts, but over on the West Coast in California was this really wonderful institute that studied neurodevelopment, everything from cells in petri dish to looking at children and adults and whole populations. And I applied and got accepted to spend 2 years studying with all of these greats and just learning everything I could about what do we know today about autism, so that I could take my tools and my interests and see if I couldn't try to address questions in that field. And so I spent 2 years there. That was at a medical school. So I went from the public education to working in a medical school. And then about 7 years ago, I realized that medical school research was really interesting, but I was missing that teaching component. And so I then moved back over to the East Coast, to Massachusetts, to work at Mount Holyoke College, which is a liberal arts college that balances both really engaging teaching with really high quality research. So I have a very high-end research lab here, and also engage with students and spend half my time teaching and half doing research. And Mount Holyoke, we're pretty focused on educating women, because we believe here that there's not enough representation of women and minorities in science. And so that's an interest of mine, and I've been working hard to promote that both in Mount Holyoke, but also I've developed a project with the municipality of San Juan. We've been going down for 2 summers now and teaching science to young girls in San Juan, Puerto Rico, so that they can have that same experience I had, which is hey, you're pretty good at this. Have you ever thought about becoming a scientist? Mm-hmm. So what's great about my field, and I want to kind of pause and say, if there are questions, I'd much rather kind of hear what's on your mind than gab at you. So, please interrupt if there's something that's caught your attention. But I'll take a moment and kind of share some of the big projects we're working on right now in my lab. I mentioned briefly the vaping or e-cigarette study that we just finished, that we looked at whether or not using e-cigarettes during pregnancy has effects on those offspring. So we would take mice and get them pregnant and expose them to that e-cigarette vapor, and then when their babies are born, follow them up through their life and look and see how they behave. Give them some learning tasks, give them some emotion-driven tasks, and see whether or not that experience the mom had actually influences that offspring as they grow up. Another big project is to look at the immune system of the mother. And what we're learning, one of the big kind of interesting, fairly new parts of my field, is that we're realizing that your immune system is very important for your nervous system or for your brain. And if I wasn't a believer, and if you're not either, I can say, think about the last time you were sick. And the last time you were sick, you didn't want to go play with your friends. You didn't want to go to school. You couldn't think straight. You probably didn't sleep appropriately, and you slept too much. And that's a real indication that our immune system is communicating with our nervous system. And so I've been digging deep and learning about how our immune system actually plays a role in shaping our brain. And a lot of who we are and who we grow up to be depends on how we start out as fetuses and young babies as our brain is growing. So when you get a cut, your immune system knows how to put you back together. Turns out that your brain, when it's growing, your immune system is really important for shaping that. So what happens when a mother, for example, gets really sick while she's pregnant? She gets the flu, gets COVID-19, gets allergies or asthma. What are the impacts on that developing fetus? And does that change their likelihood for mental health challenges in the future? And so we, again, do this with mice, where we get them pregnant and then give them a mild cold or an allergy attack. And we're looking to see to what extent does that change the way those mice solve problems, or how anxious or much of a risk taker they are once they grow up into adulthood.
Very interesting. The fact that you could track all of that through the babies, I don't even know what you'd look for.
Well, you can't ask a mouse, how are you feeling? Right. But if you ever owned a pet, if you ever owned a dog or a cat, cats are harder. They tend to be more stoic, but you know when your dog is really happy and excited, or when your dog is sleepy. And when you go to bring your dog to, say, the dog park, and you look to see how that dog socializes, you wouldn't expect a dog to shake hands with another dog, but you would expect that dog to sniff the nose and the kind of the butt of the other dog. And so you'd say that's an appropriate dog social behavior. And if it looks different from that, you'd know something maybe needs to be addressed. Your dog might not be feeling well. So the same goes for mice, that we first have to figure out what's a mouse typically do, and how would we then change that. And in fact, I can show you for fun's sake a video of one of the questions we ask our mice if I can figure out technology. So Matt, just let me know once I get this started whether you're seeing my screen here.
Yeah, it looks like it's coming up.
Slides.
Let's see.
So this is just an image of my lab here, and those are some of my students, and we've got mice in those cages, and we're I don't know, inspecting them. But I want to share with you one example of how we ask our mice questions. So let's see, we'll do this one right here. So this is a question about how anxious is a mouse. So if any of you have ever had a mouse in your house, you'll notice they tend to spend times along the walls, or if everyone goes to sleep or is away, then that mouse will venture into the center. So we know that mice like to stay in enclosed areas, and they don't like venturing out into big areas, but they will take a risk if they need to. So we put them in this little thing called the elevated plus maze. And two sides of this maze are completely closed off, and the mouse is really comfortable there. And two sides, they're open, and the whole maze is about 3 feet or a meter off the ground, so the mouse can't jump off. And that mouse has to choose between staying safe in those closed areas and going to venture out into the open areas. I don't know. I have a video playing. I don't know how well it comes through over the internet, but you can see my little white mouse here. He's spending a lot of the time in those closed areas, and he's just kind of peeking out right now into these open areas, but not really willing to go out onto the far edge. And that's an indication this mouse doesn't want to take a lot of risks. Anybody who is or knows somebody on an anti-anxiety medication, those medications, before they ever given to a human, were tested on mice in a challenge just like this, and they found that drugs that reduce anxiety in a human make a mouse more willing to take a risk and go out on these open arms. So no, mice don't have anxiety. No, a mouse doesn't have autism. But from evolution, we know there are some very similar brain structures and functions that could give us some insights into what's going on in a mouse brain, and to what extent is that similar and informative for humans. Try to go back to my face again.
But I have a question.
Please, thank you.
So like I noticed the mice was like not going to the edge of the other one, but like how does a mice know that side is not closed?
So that's a great question. So the video you're looking at top down, so it's hard to get a sense, but the mouse, first of all, has whiskers, so it's feeling the edges of the wall with its whiskers. It's a sense that we really don't have, but they know they're in tight spaces when their whiskers start to fold in a bit, and they actually feel comfortable with that. So they can see as well, so they can see nothing but walls around them, and they can feel the walls. When they poke their head around the sides, what they're looking out to is a big open room, and so they're actually getting us, and we have a big bright light above them. So they feel like they're being exposed when they come out into the open. So we're really using all of their senses to make sure that they understand where is it safe and where are they maybe taking a risk.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question. So I'll keep gabbing until there's more questions, but I like that question, so keep them coming. One of the things I want to kind of share, because I'm sure you're all thinking about like career-wise, there's a lot you can do with a science degree. I don't really want to necessarily focus just on neuroscience, because learning to be a scientist, really, whether it's biology, chemistry, neuroscience, geology, they give you a lot of important tools in terms of how to ask a question, how to gather data, and how to make a decision based on those data. And we are living in a big data world, from Facebook and Twitter to now COVID-19, where every country in the world is putting data together so we can try to answer questions and make predictions. And when you go into a science field, whether it's neuroscience or statistics or some other quantitative field, you really gain the tools to make your own decisions based on information. So one of the scary things that kind of my family and I are experiencing is when we don't know something, we have to trust the news, right? Except that if we start to educate ourselves about how to answer questions from, say, a science degree, then we can go out into the world and gather our own information and not have to rely on others for making decisions, but know what truth is based on how we're investigating it. From more specifically a neuroscience degree, you could go into certainly medicine, but you can also go into industry, A lot of people are looking at, for example, iPhones or cell phones. Why are they so easy to use? Well, it requires studying how do people interact with things and how do we make that better, right? I know there's arguments like where do the buttons go on the phone? Well, you have to use some basic neuroscience and psychology research to measure, well, how are people holding these things and how do they use them? They're called human factors. And everything from remote controls to airplanes, we have to think about what makes it easier for a human to use these objects. Certainly teaching, that's where I ended up landing, both between this teaching and research field. But science education is something that is always coming secondary to, say, reading and math. And I don't want to bash reading and math because those are important, but we need more science education for some of those reasons I said before, because the more we're educated, the more we can all make the right decisions based on the information we're given.
That's one of the, I do think Massachusetts is putting funding behind that because, in the last couple of years, they funded this whole STEM at Work program, which, gives me the time and salary to set all this kind of stuff up. And it looks like they're going to continue to do that even despite the current situation. So
that's wonderful.
It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. I mean, we're living in one of the strongest research states of the country. You go to Boston, that's where I studied. Massachusetts is absolutely towards the top, and clearly they're putting their money where their mouth is. Yeah. I believe as one of the students funded from this program work in my lab last summer, and she's gone on to do a neuroscience degree at Pomona. So clearly the investment is paying off through the pipeline.
Yeah.
And when I mentioned that I'm interested in good representation in the sciences, women, other underrepresented populations, it's not just college students or even high school students. It's starting education, say, in elementary school, and moving it all the way through. And so, yeah, I would say Massachusetts really has that in their forefront.
Yep. So do we have any other questions from the students here? I'd love to have you answer anything that they'd like to bring up. Anything at all, folks, about how much does a scientist at a college level make? What's the future of neuroscience? What does it look like? What are some of the major questions being asked?
Oh, I have a question.
I have a question.
Sure. Is that?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Asia.
Okay. I was just gonna ask, how many years of college did you have to go through to get to where you at?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm still paying it off. That's a really important question. Well, and I want to be clear about how many years to get to where I am versus how many years to get to other types of jobs related to science, right? So I have a PhD, which means I first got a bachelor's degree. That's 4 years. I then went on for a master's degree. That's 2 years. And then your PhD is another 3 to 5 years on top of that. So all in from the start of college, about nine or so years until I got my PhD. But then you do what's called a postdoc or postdoctoral fellowship. So once you have your degree and they call you doctor, you still have to go for more teaching. You end up working under somebody else's research lab to try to develop your own research questions. And so that was another 2 years for me, but those can go anywhere from 2 to 6 years. So you're really looking at a decade to 15 years from the start of college until you have your own research lab. But I enjoyed every step of the way. For me, it wasn't about the finish line. In fact, I didn't know what my finish line was along the way. I didn't know I was going to become a teacher at Mount Holyoke until I was a year into my postdoc. What I kept doing is enjoying what I was doing. So I loved working in a lab as an undergraduate. So I then went to grad school because it was so much fun. As grad school was coming to an end, I thought, where do I want to go next? And that led me to the Mind Institute because I was fascinated with the autism research world. So that was a 2-year postdoc. And then I wanted some teaching experience. So I went and taught for a few years on a part-time contract with Mount Holyoke before landing this more stable position. So it is a long haul, but if you wanted to say get right into the research world, you can go to college for 4 years and then do what's called bench work, where you're in a lab doing the work. Typically, you come up to a ceiling there where you can't really ask your own questions until you get more education. So then you go for a master's where you really learn how to start designing experiments. And if you want to run your own lab, that's when you go for the PhD.
And directly out of college before grad school, how easy was it to like get a job, like a paying job?
Uh, yeah, I feel like I never actually have gotten a job yet because I'm still in school, right? Because I'm choosing. But
Right.
I love the question, and I'm struggling to answer it because I was really fortunate. I ended up landing. So while I was working as an undergraduate, I got courted by the same guy who I was working for as an undergraduate. He said to me, "Do you want to come be my graduate student and go to grad school?" So he kind of opened that door for me and offered it to me, which is I don't think that's a common path, but it worked for me. And then while I was finishing up my doctoral work, I started applying for postdocs and was able to land one right out of graduate school. And then while I was postdocing, I was applying for other jobs. And I should note, as I've moved through the workforce to higher and higher levels, I get rejected more and more along the way. So it is where I am now as a faculty member at a liberal arts college. I've had a good 10 formal rejections, meaning 10 of them where I got an interview and they said no thank you, but another 30 or 40 where they never even called me back. Part of that is because academia, there are so few positions and so many people that want to be in academia. But I can tell you that going right from college to a bench working in a lab is super easy. There are people with research labs all around the country that are looking for workhorses, students who have basic knowledge from college who they need them in the lab to collect the data. So I was always a fan of Mythbusters. I don't know if you're on the Discovery Channel, but I always love that show because they showed you how much time in a lab is the same thing again and again for hours and hours. So being a scientist is like 95% redundancy and 5% cool. In my own lab, my students spend most of their time picking up poop and cleaning urine from plastic cages. What I mean by that is we set up the experiment, we put a mouse in a box, and we walk away, and the mouse does its job. We don't do anything. When we're done with that mouse, we put the mouse in its cage. We have to clean up after that mouse and set up for the next experiment. So we have to make sure all the odors are taken out. And so my students have to spend a lot of time washing and cleaning and drying and getting ready for the next one. And then you put a new mouse in the cage, you walk away. So much of science is really low-level redundant work, but that's what's needed to collect the data. So it is super easy out of undergraduate to get those jobs because you don't need to have really specialized skills. You learn some of the small details while you're on the job. As you move through the ranks to, say, a PhD, then it becomes more competitive because now you're vying for money, grant money, for example, to run your lab, and there is so few dollars for that.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think there was
I
another
have a
question.
question. Yeah, I
Thank
have
you.
like a lot now. The first one is you mentioned how like you got like 10 formal rejections and like the other ones people just didn't call you back. So in
Mm-hmm.
my head that added up to 40 rejections. How did you deal with so much rejections like at once? Like I'm a type of person if I get rejected 2 times, I look for something new. But then you
Mm.
moved from this career of like wanting to be a teacher to like to science to a science field and like you're being rejected, like you didn't go back to be like, oh, let me go back to teaching. You still went further until like you made it through. Like how did you deal with that? And
Yeah.
also know that you wanted to do science.
Yeah, that's a really important question. I really appreciate that. I have two thoughts on that. One I'll get back to in a second, which is getting rejected in ways as a high school student when I was younger, getting rejected were some of the more kind of formative moments in my life. Do I call it quits or keep going? And so I want to get back to that because really, I think your character is defined by how you deal with obstacles and setbacks, not how you are when you're succeeding, but how you are when you're failing really shapes who you are and how you're going to be in life. The other more kind of low-hanging fruit I want to touch on first is that science is all about failure and rejection. And here's what I mean by that. I'll spend months writing a grant or writing a paper or designing an experiment, collecting data, and the experiment fails, or the data don't show my hypothesis, or I'll submit a grant and they write back and say, sorry, we're not giving you money. And so to run your own research lab is to get rejected way more than you get elevated or accepted. And so part of science is you ask a question or you have a hypothesis and you test if that's right or not. So inherently in science is to test whether or not you're right or wrong. And most of the time I'm wrong. And it's not just me, Jared, it's science is wrong. We have a guess and we're wrong so many of the times. And so part of staying in science is developing those tools to kind of embrace those and go, okay, well, that didn't work. What should I do next time? Or how can I make this different or better and improve it? And part of that is getting some thick skin and recognizing that it's not rejecting me, Jared, because I'm an awful person. It's just rejecting the idea or that I made a mistake or I could do better next time, right? So part of it is trying to stay true to yourself and not read too much into that rejection. In part because finding a job, say, at a liberal arts college where I am, is I need to look for that one school that had the one opening where they're looking for somebody who does the one specific thing I do, right? So, and at the time I'm ready to apply because faculty like to get their jobs and stay in their job for 30 years. So if my wife wanted to really live back in Massachusetts, so now I need to find one school in Massachusetts in the 1 year, or it was multiple years that I was applying, that was looking for someone who did the work I did. And so the odds are very small. And so I was ready for that. The other thing I want to come back to is it's kind of a sidestep for a second, but it's a good anecdote is, in my free time, I used to, and I don't as much anymore, but I played the saxophone. I still like to dabble in it. Clearly, I wasn't that great in it because I'm not a musician. I'm a scientist today. But I remember when I was in high school, when I was in elementary school, I heard the high school band playing a concert, and I knew then I wanted to try to play the saxophone. And I learned the saxophone for years so I could try to be in this band. And I worked my butt off to learn the saxophone, and it came time for the audition. This is what I've been working for 10 years or so. Third grade to 10th grade. So yeah, 7 years. And it came time and I auditioned for the band. This was it, the culminating moment I had defined in high school. Everything's defined. It's hard to think outside high school when you're in high school. I remember those years, they were tough. I didn't get into the band, and that was my one and only shot. And so that was my moment to realize, maybe I'm just not meant to be a saxophone player. I should quit. And yeah, for a few days I quit. But when I get rejected, I don't want to get angry. I get even. And so I wanted to show everybody it was a bad move to reject me. So I actually continued to play and study. And I found myself 2 years later playing in a professional band with the band leader from that high school that rejected me. We were playing side by side in this band. And so it was an opportunity for me to kind of show him, I know you said no to me, but look what you gave up on, because I'm still here and now I'm playing right next to you. Right. So that was a moment in my life where I realized I need to make a choice. When people say no to me, how do I want to handle that? Right. And that doesn't say that it doesn't hurt, because when I get rejected, it hurts sometimes. And I give myself a few days to cry about it and do some self-care and maybe eat some junk food, and it's okay. I need a few days to really take care of me. But then after that, I start thinking, okay, well, what's next? How do I want to get back on the horse and try this again? And so I think, trying to come back to your really important question here, is you need to fail at something 9 or 90 times before you get that one success, right? 2 is certainly not enough. And so maybe change your expectations that you're going to fail 9 times before you get that one success.
I would also add, part of what I hear, and it's true in my own life, and hearing from multiple professionals, is that sometimes something chooses you. Mm-hmm. A field of interest or something like that comes and chooses you. You didn't ask for it, but it turned something on in you that you can't really deny. You're like, that was the most fun I've had ever doing something in school, mm-hmm. or at work. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, so you get rejected. I think what happens is that you have to stay true to that, because maybe you're not going to be happy unless you get to do that thing. Right. And so it's just a matter of sticking with it. But every time you get rejected, figure out what it was. It might not have had anything to do with you. Maybe right. you applied to some place and they were doing an internal hire, as it turns out. Right. Or maybe it was just due to some factor that was completely out of your control. But if there is a way to improve, if the value of failure is to learn from it so you can improve, then find whatever that thing is. Maybe your cover letter needs to be better. Maybe you should have, worked hard to find out who exactly the cover letter should have gone to, because that was actually the person who was interviewing you, something like that. So yeah, I think this failure, nothing instructs, nothing teaches you like failing at something. So I would certainly encourage kids, don't be afraid of it. Know it's going to be part of the process, and keep persevering.
I always,
I have another question.
please go ahead.
Okay, so you know how you went from wanting to be a teacher to like wanting to be a scientist?
Hmm.
The same thing happened to me, but like it was on reverse. So I have like passion to be like a scientist, but like I don't have the skill to be a scientist. Like I am scared, I can't do it.
Mm.
But then I don't really have a passion for like the future job, but like I am so good at it. So I can like risk to like make people lose their lives because I have the passion to be a doctor and I can't really be a doctor. So like how did you deal with like the change? Like was it the passion that drove you away from wanting to be a teacher? And if it wasn't the passion, like how did you deal with like the career change because you went to school for 2 years, like you're so inclined to being a teacher, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden that changed. Like how did you deal with that too?
Yeah. First of all, I don't know why you think you don't have the skills to be a scientist.
I
You
have been to like an intern before and I was so scared and
Yeah,
it did not go well.
but I don't know how old you are, but I doubt you're old enough where you've experienced everything in the world. And I would like to challenge and say there's a lot more that's expected you will learn because of how early you are in your education, right? And I think that I'm going to get to your question in a second, but I think that there's so much, we do such a disservice to make science sound so technical and so thinky and complex. And I think those are awful science teachers right there, right? Because what good is knowledge if you can't communicate it, right? What good is discovering something new if you can't send it out so everyone can understand it? And so everything can and should be boiled down to tangible things we can all get. And the actual skill in it, like I said, with not to be too crude, but most of what I do in my day is pick up mouse poop, right? I'm pretty sure that you don't need a PhD to do that. Yeah, there are other technical things that I do in terms of dealing with the money and getting grants, but the actual physical putting your hands on science are very simple. If you can work in a kitchen, if you ever baked cookies, then you're going to be great in a chemistry lab, right? And so I don't want you to let go of this interest in being a doctor or a scientist because you don't think you have the knowledge. I'm assuming you're in high school, and no high school student will ever have enough knowledge because they're only in high school. You have so much more opportunity and time that you need in order to learn these things.
I have something to add into that.
Okay.
It's like if you teach me to be a doctor, I would really like be a great doctor. But this is the problem. I am so scared of blood, and I have been to
Oh.
like an intern before, and I saw like a human tissue, and I was so scared of that. So that I cannot deal with because I've been scared of blood even before I was a teenager, and now I'm a teenager. I am so scared
Okay.
of blood.
Well, I
So
appreciate
that
that
I
detail.
cannot afford to be a doctor.
Okay, well, maybe not, right? So because we can, let me put my neuroscientist hat on. We can desensitize. We can get used to things that used to give us kind of a visceral or uncomfortable response, and so
Yeah.
maybe, but maybe it's the case that you think you want to be a doctor, but you don't like blood, and maybe the realities of what it means to be a doctor don't even interest you. I see so many students that come to me that want to be doctors, and I say, have you ever worked in a hospital? Have you ever been in a medical clinic? Because it's so much dealing with insurance and paperwork, and you hardly ever get to see patients. And they go, I didn't know any of that. And I said, before you go be a doctor, go experience what it's like to be a doctor, because it's very different than what we glorify it as on a television screen.
Yeah.
So coming back around to what you said before, because maybe it's the case that you haven't quite found your passion yet. So you mentioned to me about me pivoting from teaching to becoming a scientist.
Yeah.
I got to give more of that story, which is when I moved to the medical school to do research all the time. The first year, I mean, I was working hard, and my wife was kind of giving me a hard time. She's like, "You're really stressed, you're really working hard." She's like, "Something's missing." And I went to the school and I said, can I teach a little bit on the side? They had this little freshman seminar where like anybody who was a researcher could take a few freshmen and teach a small little course. And I was my second year as a postdoc, and I got permission. I was like, all right, I'm gonna teach a little course. And I put a little course together. And I came home after the first or second class, and I told my wife about it, and she stopped me and she said, Jared, something's very different about you today. I said, what? She goes, you are glowing. You are so happy. And she got me to realize that I never wanted to let go of teaching, and I do have a passion for teaching. What I didn't like is teaching in the public school system, and I don't want to formally bash public education, but there's a lot of challenges in teaching in the public education because there's a lot of restrictions. You have to follow the curriculum, and there's a lot of good reason for it, but I'm way too rebellious and creative where I want to invent my own and think about interesting new ways of teaching, and I couldn't do that at the public school level, but I could at the college level. I had no idea when I was in college that you could teach at the college level creatively. I had to go and work in a medical school and stumble on this opportunity. And so where I am now is not as I'm fusing the two. I love science, but I couldn't do it all the time because I missed the teaching. And so now I teach half my day and I research half my day, and I get the best of both my worlds.
I think one of the takeaways in all this is, given especially where you high schoolers are in your lives, between now and whatever you settle on, now is the time when you get to just experiment and go after opportunities that seem completely out of left field or may or may not be interesting to you. You don't know, but there's some reason that's spurring you on to go try it. Experiment. Expose yourself to things that you're afraid of doing, but that have some interest to you, because it's a great opportunity. You can do that through your entire life. I mean, I'm not afraid of going off and doing something new. I happen to like very much what I'm doing, but I don't feel limited by whatever obligations or commitments, that kind of stuff. I know that really the lifeblood of being satisfied is being on that cutting edge, that learning edge. And especially where you are now, it's a great time to just be getting lots of exposure to different things.
Matt,
So I would encourage that.
I want to add to that, which is don't be afraid to admit when you don't like something. So when I deal with students after every semester, I say, what was your least favorite course? Or is there anything you really hated? And they go, oh, I really hated my whatever course. And I go, that's fantastic. And they look at me, what do you mean that's fantastic? I said, we can cross it off and go, that is not an area you should ever explore again. You tried it, you don't like it. Now, what did you do like? And let's do more like that. So even, think about your classes now in high school. What are the classes that you just can't wait to be over with for good? And that's an indicator that that's not the way to go. I do want to preface, though, by saying, make sure to distinguish between your interest in the subject and the quality of the teacher, because I've had some students who come to me who are like, I'm really bad at chemistry, or I'm really bad at biology. And I'm like, are you bad at biology, or did you just have a bad biology teacher? Because when they take another course here at Mount Holyoke and they realize with some of the innovative ways we're teaching that actually they love it. And so, and again, I don't want to bash any particular teachers. There's always this like compliment of, is the teacher the right teacher for that student? And sometimes it's a mismatch for no particular reason. And so try not to put so much of the blame on yourself and think about, well, what interests me, or what didn't go well? How much of that is me? How much is that kind of the external? And where do I want to do more of? Where do I want to do less of?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I have a question. It's kind of going back to the start of all of this, but I know you talked about how you like to look at problems in the world and how you could potentially solve them. So I was hoping you could talk about how you decide what specifically you want to research, kind of how you narrow that in, or like where you find inspiration for your studies.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so to get technical for a little bit, running your own research lab is very expensive. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, $1 million. And so you have to go out and get money. So a lot of what I do now as a researcher is not work in the lab. I do fundraising. I hire other people to do, and I have students at Mount Holyoke who do a lot of the work itself, because I'm spending all my time either sharing the research with the world and trying to bring in money to keep the lab going. And so there's an important balance of finding something that interests me, but also something where investors want to invest in it because they think it's useful for the world. And so I'm speaking for the moment to the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, which are two government agencies where tax dollars get put into these agencies. And then there are scientists whose job it is to decide, how does this money get spent? Which research do we want to invest in? So I am always looking to see both what am I interested in, what are the tools I have, and what will likely get funded. What are some questions that my peers in the field and that these government bodies are going to find are worth investing in? So part of that is thinking about what's the latest interest and trend. So I mentioned I just finished this e-cigarette study. Well, I'm currently really interested in now vaping marijuana. Why am I interested in this? Because Massachusetts has relaxed their marijuana policies. Vaping is much more popular, and we don't know a lot about marijuana through vaping or marijuana and pregnancy. And so the topic interests me. I have tools in my lab to address it. And I think I could sell this as an important question because now we're moving into a place where more and more teens and people of childbearing age are going to see marijuana as their medicine. And yet we don't know to what extent is it medicine or not for the developing fetus. So it's all about, it's kind of a puzzle where you have to think about what can I do, but also to what extent will other people, can I convince other people that it's important and interesting work to do?
Does that answer your question, Natalie?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
Great, thanks, good.
Go
Hi.
ahead, Krish.
Yeah, I had a question. So, you mentioned you were a host for the STEM and Work program.
Yeah.
So, what kind of research do high school students do at your lab? Like when we come to intern in the summer?
Right. So I should say this summer we're not taking students because of the current restrictions. We can't all gather together. But I'd like you all to keep me in mind in the future because I had such a great experience. So the high school students do everything exactly as the college students do. There's no differentiation. So for starters, we need to make pregnant moms and mouse babies. We have to grow mice in our lab. So that means very simply putting a boy mouse and a girl mouse together in a cage at night. The lights go off. We go home, come in the next morning, and you actually have to check under the tail for a seminal plug to see whether or not the male and female mated that night. The reason for that is we know exactly it's about 19 days for a mouse to gestate, to grow. So we want to know how long is that mother in pregnancy. So you put the mice together, the next morning you take them apart and see whether or not they're pregnant. The next thing we have to do is give that mom some sort of exposure, whether it's e-cigarettes or an allergy attack or hopefully soon cannabinoids. So the student would put the mouse in one of our boxes that you turn on the machine blows in, whether it's the allergen or the e-cigarette vapor. And you run that each day. You got to kind of keep track of which mouse is which day old or which day in pregnancy, and then give that mouse that treatment. And then the other piece is running the mouse through these behavior tasks like that plus maze task I just showed you. So that would be another thing the students do. You put a mouse in the cage and you hit go on the tape recorder or the video recorder. And then when you're done, you put the mouse back in their cage, and then the real work happens. You have to pick up the poop and clean it off and get ready for the next mouse. After that, so every part of this I'm describing is what the students are doing. After that, we have all these videos, and we have to run our videos through some really cool computer software. I'm going to share my screen again. Because I want to show you, we use some really cool tools that allow us to track our mice. So let's see. Can you see this video right here? So this is two mice socializing. No different than I mentioned, like dogs in a park that are socializing. And we video record this. And you have to know to what extent are mice sniffing each other. We expect them to sniff their noses, their bodies, their tails. And it used to be the case that students in my lab would have to sit there with stopwatches and record all this, but that's really time consuming and not very reliable data-wise. So what we do is use computer vision software, and this is software that I teach the students in my lab, high school and college students, to do. And the software finds the mice, and we color their fur blue and pink so we can keep track of them. The software finds the nose, the body, and the tail, and is able to draw little line segments around them. And so we set up the parameters, and we hit go, and then the computer will actually track these mice. So you'll see on the right-hand side what the computer sees. On the left are the mice. And then the bottom are just some data that we gather, but we measure how much are these nose points in contact with the nose and body. And so a lot of time goes into drawing that data from the videos by plugging them into software. The same software we teach students also can measure to what extent they're sniffing in what are called heat maps. So this is a mouse here that had to choose between, on the left side, playing with another mouse, or on the right side, playing with an object. And the darker colors are where they spent more of their time sniffing. You can see this mouse spent more time socializing with another mouse. And again, we have to get our computer software to recognize the video, so we program that. The last thing I'll tell you about is that we actually run a lot of biological assays. So we take the brains, and students can actually help us process the brains by measuring different chemicals. And if you know how to bake cookies, you know how to do this. And so students do this as well, where you mix up the brain in a little tube, and then you add some chemicals, and you put it in a machine that reads different proteins from it. So kind of put simply, students, high school and college students, do everything in my lab. I don't differentiate, and very little of this requires any technical skill, and whatever technical skill is required, we give it to you on the job.
Awesome.
Good. Yeah. So shameless plug, think of my lab in future years if any of you are eligible.
Yeah.
Because I had such a great experience, and it's you know, I mentioned before, science is about a lot of redundancy. I need great people who don't have any talent but are willing to learn. I can teach you it. I just need you here so I can teach you to put your hands on things and then learn on the job.
Cool. Any other questions for Dr. Schwartzer today? You know, one thing I find myself thinking about is, could you just, you know, rattle off a list of the types of jobs that you know are available to people with an expertise in neuroscience? You had mentioned before things like working with industry to figure out how to devise technology so that people can work with it more easily. What other stuff, what other kinds of jobs do people have?
So there's a lot of startup companies, new tech, that are trying to do like brain machine interface. There's everything from like medical stuff. So like one example is there are these kind of EEG machines. You kind of put this little cap on that measures your electrodes, and they're working for people with attention deficit, where the machine, the cap is reading your brain waves, and then it's being translated to a computer screen where you can visually see, and you play a game by thinking really hard and moving a cursor or moving a spaceship. And we're finding for kids, it's getting them more in touch with their own neural circuits in a very kind of subconscious way. And so that's an emerging field where neuroscientists are going into. There are biotech industries. So everyone right now is scrambling to develop new tests for COVID-19, whether it's to test if you have it or if you've been infected by it, and you need biomedical researchers for that. So you go into research that way. Certainly teaching at the high school, community college level, medical school I mentioned, but really also, so I work in the psychology department, so I'm somewhere between biology and psychology. If you don't know what you want to do in life and you get a degree in psychology, that is some of the most broad liberal training in the world, because you learn about how to deal with people in a broad way, whether it's from dealing with big social issues to learning about the way people think and approaching it from either an educational standpoint or like a population standpoint. There's another one. I tell my students to go into public health. So let's say for the person who asks a question, you know, I really like medicine, but I don't know if I can deal with blood. Well, going into, say, a master's in public health, you are now thinking about medicine not from an individual patient, but from a huge kind of system structure level. How do we get all of the resources to the people we need? Why are some communities have more health issues, and why are there these disparities, and how do I fix that? Or public policy. How do I change the insurance industry so that we can better provide people with care? And so you go into a neuroscience education, gives you the understanding so that you can then go to public health and public policy. So let me just recap. Public health, public policy, startup companies, there was biotech, there was research and development, either new startups or in academia, and then there's teaching. Did I double dip? Maybe not.
I don't think so. No. One of the students here just shared that it's exactly what his brother did, I think, was going to public policy, if I'm understanding right.
He was first going into neuroscience, and then he changed to be he's now a public health fellow.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And we need new young minds. I think there's a lot of people in public health that are maybe thinking about things one way. And what's good about all of you is you're all growing up in a new world with the internet and social networking. And so you're already grown up in a way where you're thinking about things in a way that, say, I don't think it that way because I didn't have social media. And so there might be a problem that needs to be solved that I don't have the creative capacity to solve because I never thought that way. But you, who lived in the social media world, see a solution in a way I couldn't because I never had that. So So don't underestimate your youth as a in this case, it's an asset, not a setback, even though you don't have the experience yet.
Yeah.
I
Well,
oh
I
sorry.
think. Go ahead. No, go right ahead.
I have always been really interested in neuroscience, but I'm also worried because I don't love like animal cruelty, certain testing with animals. I'm wondering if you've ever had maybe students who also were like, I'm just wondering kind of what that would look like. I don't know.
No, it's an important question, and so even though I work with animals, I often have to have a moral ethic check with my own self, right? Like, it's not the case that because I work with animals, I never think about it. There are times where I have to think like, do I want to keep doing this or not? Not because I am torturing animals. Quite the contrary. I have an incredible amount of oversight. The federal government has to oversee what I do. I need approval from my institution before I do anything. And so there's more oversight in animal research than there is in animal for like meat packing plants, right? Especially because we need to keep our animals alive and well versus in a food packaging place that they're trying to move them through for the meat. So that being said, I think it's always important when I engage with students to have this dialogue, because the dialogue both challenges me and gets me to really make sure I'm always, if no one ever challenged me, I'd start to lose sight of what I'm doing and stop thinking about the important ethics, right? So I always need that. And also, it's important for the student to learn about what are the regulations, because that may or may not shift your comfort with it, right? We don't have time now for me to go over the details of regulations, but when I teach about in my courses and when students come into my lab, first, there's a lot of training. If you want to come work for me in the summer, for example, there's a lot of training you have to go through first. Some of that training includes who can you go to if you see something you think is unethical? Who can you report that to so that you stop that, right? Who's looking over my shoulder to make sure things are going correctly from the government and the institutional level? So there's that oversight piece. The other thing is even after all of that, you ethically, and it's a spectrum, and so I think it's great you're thinking about it. Where do you lie in the spectrum for use of animals for research? If you end up saying, I am completely against it, you could still be a neuroscientist. You could be a neuroscientist working with humans. You could be someone who works with, say, MRIs or those EEGs. You could become a neuroscientist that works with cells in a dish, or maybe you're okay with fruit flies but not mice. And so there's both a spectrum of what you're ethically comfortable with and a spectrum of everything from a cell to a human and in between in terms of what models we use to research with. So you just would follow an educational path that fits your ethical comforts. No one's ever going to make you put your hands on an animal if you're not ethically comfortable with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's an important
Very
question.
complete. Any other questions, folks? This has been great, Jared. Really appreciate it. So fun.
I had a great time. Thank you all for the invitation.